Although English is the most spoken language in Canada, around 20% of the population's first language is French. That's over 7 million people, most of whom live in the eastern province of Quebec. In fact, English and French are both recognized as official languages in Canada. The Charter of the French language is a law passed in 1977 by the Quebec government, making French the official language in the province. Over 95% of the people in Quebec speak French, and more than 70% regard themselves as francophone, or native French speaker. The charter was created to preserve the status of the French language, and as a result, in Quebec, French is the approved language relating to government, education, and the general workplace. You'll see magazines, restaurant menus, and billboards written only in French. And up until recently, most of the Quebec road signs were also only in French, although many of them have since been replaced with pictograms. These include easy-to-understand symbols for non-French speakers. However, French is still the predominant language on the Quebec signage. French is also the language of instruction in Quebec schools, with English being offered as a second language of study. Not all schools are compelled to provide English courses either. Parents in Quebec who want more of an English upbringing for their children have the option of sending them to an English immersion school, where the focus is stronger on English as well as French. Similarly, after school, the Quebec workplace is based around speaking and understanding French. Unless their job involves dealing with other languages, all workers in Quebec have the right to function in French. A role in international sales of customer service might demand English or other language skills, but a job dealing with the general public is almost certainly going to be requiring French. To put it simply, if you wanted to work in places like Montreal or Quebec City, you'd best have a general understanding of the French language. So, how did all of this come to be? Why is it that French is one of Canada's official languages when it's mostly only the people in Quebec that speak it? It all started way back in the 16th century. Jacques Cartier was a French explorer. In 1534, he basically sailed west from France in search of a new route to Asia. Cartier eventually arrived on the Canadian east coast at the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which he claimed the new territory on behalf of France. And although Cartier didn't quite set up any long-standing settlement in the new land, he paved the way for Samuel de Champlain. Champlain came across in 1604 and soon established settlements in Quebec City and Port Royal. They were initially only a few hundred settlers, most being lured by the fur trade, which was a lucrative business back in Europe. This new territory was known as New France, and with it came the distribution of land to the French colonists. In 1642, the French settlers built Ville-Marie, which grew up to become Montreal. Throughout the 17th century, French colonization of the region continued, with the implementation of French laws, language, and Roman Catholicism. This was all to change, however, in the 18th century. England and France were to become heavily engaged in a series of conflicts that raged from Europe all the way across the North American colonies. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, was fought from 1756 to 1763. It was basically a struggle for dominance of the respective English and French empires. England's military might have eventually overpowered France, which led to the huge loss of amounts of French territory in North America. The Treaty of Paris was signed, the France handling over huge portions of its land to Britain and Spain. Although Britain had soundly defeated France in North America, India and the Caribbean, another massive conflict was brewing. Britain was intent on maintaining control over its North American colonies. However, there was discontent among 13 of these colonies. They wanted greater independence from British rule, and they were unhappy with the heavy taxes levied on them, which were to help from recovering war costs. Britain was concerned that Quebec would form an alliance with the 13 colonies, and to help keep the French settlers on their side, the Quebec Act was passed in 1774. The Quebec Act allowed the tolerance of Roman Catholicism, the practice of French civil law, and the traditional French distribution of land. While English law still ruled in terms of public administration, the act was an effort to secure the allegiance of French settlers. It was actually proving to be a worthy strategy. When American forces rebelled against British troops, the French Canadians remained neutral. After the American War of Independence, Britain retained Canadian Nova Scotia and Quebec. Throughout the 19th century, British settlers were continuing to flock to Canada and spreading west. The area now known as Ontario was called Canada West, and there was a strong opposition to any French influence or rule. Finally, in 1867, the Dominion of Canada was formed. It was comprised of Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. French Canadians formed a minority within the new Canada, but they were given the freedom and control over its economic and political systems while being able to hold on to any traditional French customs and values. Montreal was fast to grow and quickly became Canada's major economic center. Quebec's French-Canadian population also continued to grow, as did the labor force for Quebec's industrial and rural expansion. However, the bulk of Quebec's workforce were semi-skilled French Canadians, and the powermongers were from the British aristocratic classes. Ontario, meanwhile, began to flourish and form a strong alliance with the United States. This was as much to do with the shared language as was geography. After World War II, back over in Quebec, there was a large influx of French immigration. This time, there were many professionals and educated business people who were relocated either to Quebec or other major Canadian cities. In 1969, Canada's Official Languages Act was passed, which was supported by all federal political parties. Nevertheless, only New Brunswick voluntarily opted for official bilingualism, while other provinces settled for providing basic French language services in specific situations. Despite this, there remains areas of French-speaking Canadians spread throughout the country. Of course, the situation isn't unique to Canada. Countries including Switzerland, India, and Ireland are also officially multilingual, with speakers of several languages living in their societies. Even though 95% of the people in Quebec speak French, there's still a push for more status to be given to French speakers in Canada. The country's biggest railway and airline companies have been underrepresented by French speakers, and more emphasis is being placed on the importance of embracing Canada's French heritage. This might very much become the norm one day, with multilingual societies becoming prevalent around the globe. As many communities are becoming more and more multicultural, people are slowly starting to question why English should remain so dominant.